Okay, well, thank you very much for the invitation to talk. I'm Phil Parks. I've been working in archaeological conservation now for well over 30 years. And until recently, I worked at Cardiff University, where I ran a commercial conservation service. But I also taught conservation to undergraduate and master's students. I now work freelance as a conservator, but also a mail maker. But that's another story. So, this I found actually quite a difficult talk to do, just in terms of how to pitch it, but also I'm going to be talking about things that sometimes didn't work out so well. And I don't want this to be something that really we focus on all the bad things and go tut tut. What I want to sort of push forward here is explore how we as the wider archaeology community can communicate better and make sure that really we can work together to best benefit archaeology as a whole. So, being based in Wales, a lot of my experience has been working with Welsh Archaeological Trusts, CADU, since the early 1990s. I've worked on site with archaeologists, including sort of one-day visits to Blockcliff finds up in Banabrycheiniog, or out in the Vale, working longer on site excavations, for example, conserving the Barlands Farm boat. But that's not to say that I've only worked in Wales. My conservation works also included being part of the conservation team at Çatalhöyük out in Turkey and working on items now on display in the Islamic Museum of Art in Doha. So, in terms of on-site work, it's everything from wading out in the mud as the Severn Estuary sort of tides go out through to sort of working in 45 degrees heat out in central Turkey. As a conservator, I like to feel part of the bigger archaeology team. And if there's no conservation to be done, I'm more than happy to sort of pitch in with the archaeological work and help out there as well. And just as a disclaimer, I'm not backing this talk up on data. Previous talk there, we saw loads of experiments and things like this. This is my personal experiences. So where things have gone wrong, it's down to my stories and things like that. I note that Gretel's abstract later on also sort of touches on a number of the same topics. So I'll be interested to see her experiences and see, are we experiencing similar things, or is it my stories that always end up going badly? I don't know. Anyway, this whole session, it's looking at what happens in a conservation facility. But what I'd like to start with, I suppose, is what is conservation? When I was teaching conservation, one of the issues the students would often be most dismayed with is objects would come into the lab and what needs doing to it would be conserve. And the students are there going, well, what does that mean? What does conserve mean? And it's something we always talk about in conservation conferences as well. What is it about an object that we're actually conserving? Are we looking at this sort of material aspects, stabilizing the metal and doing whatever? Are we looking at intangible things? Are there particular features that maybe we want to bring out of an object that say more about it? And it's interesting being here talking to a conference of archaeologists, because if we're still discussing this within conservation circles, why do we expect everybody else to know what conservation is? I think it's really important to sort of talk more and get those sort of messages out. In the context of commercial archaeology, conserving, you're really often looking at entailing X-ray, for example, assessment and analysis of the finds prior to archival storage. But this might not cover the full range of conservation that might be involved. From a public point of view, there's often other aspects that might need to be considered for display in a museum, and that can be an issue in itself. There's a real difference between conserving something to put into storage in a box to conserving something that might need to be handled by the public, or conserving something that's going on display and showing particular things. And there's aspects of analysis and interpretation that come into question as well, with find specialists maybe having particular features that they're looking for example. Analysis in the future, that can have an impact in terms of the conservation treatments that we do. And in my experience, unfortunately, this crossover between excavators in terms of what they want out of this, conservators, find specialists, it tends to happen quite infrequently. And it's partly, I think, because of the nature of the process. The finds, the sites are excavated. When the excavation is finished, those finds are sent for post-ex, for conservation. When conservation is finished, they can be sent off to the find specialists. Sometimes you'll get this sort of back and forth between the conservators and find specialists. And that's great because that can save time. Not everything needs conserving. You know, if this assessment is done right, what you're doing is weeding out the items that need further work, further analysis, and further things done to them. So where can conservation input start? My argument is right at the beginning. Working with the excavators to identify the types of material from a site that might be found, for example. You can highlight then the resources that might be needed, and that can make a big difference further down the line. If you're looking at a medieval priory, you might expect lots of glass. A damp wet site, maybe higher amounts of organic objects. Sites with a heavy crafting or industrial activity, lots of metals. They all have different resource needs and different priorities. And getting this information early on can make a big difference further down the line. So, now a bit where I'm sort of going to mention a few, I'm going to say horror stories, but a few things where things have gone wrong. Over the years, I've worked with a number of priory sites where window glass has been found. When window glass is found, it tends to be in large amounts, as in thousands of pieces. Glass is usually in large piles. The valuable lead's been robbed out. The glass has been chucked aside. Medieval window glass in particular is very susceptible to lamination if it's not stored properly. Lamination and decay if it dries out without proper care, so damp packaging tends to be recommended. Many years ago, as a cautionary story, I had a site where the glass, basically a year's worth of excavated glass, was lost. They'd had a change in finds officer, and the previous practice of storing the glass damp wasn't followed. The glass came into me and had completely delaminated and lost, and it was gone. You know, it was little more than dust in many cases in the bags. And so something that had been done, that knowledge, for whatever reason, changed, had a big impact on that year's worth of excavation. I'm going to hold my hands up here and say it's happened to me as well. We had a large amount of glass come into the labs, well packaged, damp environment. Maintenance is key with these things. It's all very well putting them in the right environment in the first place, but if you don't maintain that environment, that's when things go wrong. I had the excuse of COVID and lack of access to the labs where it went wrong, but when I came back to it, the glass was not in great condition. Top left there, iron. We've already seen from the previous talk, iron needs to be stored in a dry environment, dry conditions in order to slow corrosion rates. This corrosion can start immediately upon excavation, not upon them entering the museum. It's not about you've got to store iron properly once it enters the museum. You've got to store it properly from the first. As was mentioned, it needs drying out. It's no good packing into a box with silica gel when it's damp. All that's going to do is keep it in a continually damp environment. The silica gel will just buffer that. So drying out first and packaging properly. Likewise, putting them in card boxes and leaving them in your warehouse for 5 years, it's not a great way of storing either. I know it happens. I've been there. The problem is, iron can corrode, and when it corrodes very quickly, it's an issue. Unfortunately, I've had sites come in where bulk iron has come in, iron has been excavated from the site. I'm X-raying fragments, not X-raying objects. Only a couple of years after that iron's been excavated. That planning and that sort of storage and maintenance I mentioned is really important to do. Ceramics, usually seen as pretty robust. The Samian bowl here, cleaned on site, wet cleaned on site. About a third of the way through cleaning the pieces here, it was realised that actually the cleaning wasn't going well. They were losing some of that surface. And again, This was something that then came into the labs and we were able to sort of consolidate and clean to reveal the detail. But again, it's having access to that conservation advice, somebody to sort of get that guidance on with the sort of material that you're digging up. The one on the bottom left, this is a ceramic. This had been, it had actually been put together to get a profile, having been dug up, using a conservation safe adhesive. Got the profile and then posted the object down to me for further conservation work. Unfortunately, the object was bigger than the box. So in order to get it to fit back in the box, they took the pieces apart. A conservation safe adhesive can come apart with acetone. For whatever reason, acetone wasn't used. It was much quicker to snap the pieces apart. The pieces didn't break along the adhesive glue line. The fabric is weaker than the adhesive. It actually broke in the fabric itself. So now when I put it together, I've got two parallel breaks, the original one and the one where it's been snapped apart to put back in the box. But again, that conservation input and guidance could have helped prevent something like this. So I've said I didn't want to focus on the bad. I have with a few cases there, but how can we avoid this? Involve conservators early on in a project. Make connections with your local conservators who can provide advice on what supplies might be needed. It can make a huge amount of difference further down the line. For example, there's certain things where if they're kept damp, they're much easier to clean when we get to them. If the surface hardens and changes and then it comes to us, wetting it again can be really difficult. So it's having that sort of conservation advice in terms of how to do things. Long-term care. Packaging is not the be-all and end-all. Putting it in a box and away in the corner is not the way to do things. These things always need maintenance. As part of my job for Cadu, I was changing the silica gel in boxes in their sort of main stores for many years. And I come at this very much from a sort of practical viewpoint as well. So there's the academic studies that, you know, people do all this research that will tell you this is how you've got to layer the silica gel in the boxes to have the best effect and whatever and do all this. As somebody who's had to open up boxes and take out bags of silica gel from hundreds of boxes, I can tell you now is the best place for silica gel is where it's easiest to get it out and back in again. Do the job as quickly as possible without having to dig all through the objects. And so I'm coming at this from a practical point of view, but the point is it takes time and that time needs budgeting in. It's not just a case of we've got the materials for packaging this, it's also we've got the staff and the time available to maintain these environments. Knowing the aims of the project, you know, it's really important to sort of get a sense of that in order to sort of guide our conservation. And having worked locally in Wales for many years, I know a lot of the museums. So when finds come in, if they come in for conservation for a report, so this leather shoe, for example, we could have just conserved the pieces, had them separate, sent them on to a find specialist and job done. Knowing the museum, knowing the curator, knowing they'd want to display this, we were able to sort of do that side plus put the shoe together at the same time. This saves resources in terms of budgets for the museum. It makes the job smoother. You're able to get fine specialist input and sort of do all those things together. I know it's difficult, but what it means is, what it needs is talking and communication. So I just want to end on this slide. It sums up, I think, some of the things that I've said. We're great innovators. We make use of the resources and things that we've got. And, you know, we ensure we get as good a result as possible using the things that we've got. We've all been in a spot where we've forgotten something through poor planning. If you want a real laugh, you can ask me later about back in the mid-1990s, I was wandering around Lampeter, town in West Wales. I was dressed in my usual ripped jeans, ripped army parka, German army paraboots. I was trying to buy hypodermic needles for injecting consolidant into an object I had to lift. That was not one of my best days. I was not very successful. Or, well, I was, but not in the, yeah, anyway. What I'm trying to say is proper planning, preparation, early conversations should make things like this the exception rather than the norm. And that's where we're at. Thank you.